Napoleon once famously said that Russia is a big, frozen desert, and it seems like he was right. When the French emperor decided to invade Russia in 1812, his army numbered more than 600,000 men, but by the time his battered force limped back across the Niemen River into East Prussia, there were only around 100,000 of them left. The rest had been killed or captured by the Russian army, which had used scorched earth tactics to defeat Napoleon's Grande Armée. The Russians burned their own villages and fields to deny sustenance to the hungry French soldiers who invaded their country, but they didn't expect the sub-zero temperatures to freeze the entire French army in their tracks. Scorched earth has long been an effective military tactic. Even if it does harm innocent people and burn away the resources of the nation, you are supposedly helping by defending it. But before we get into why scorched earth sometimes works and why it failed against Napoleon, let me tell you about our sponsor. In ancient warfare, your army would often need supplies dropped off to them during long marches or campaigns. And the fastest way to do this was usually with pack animals, but not these kinds of pack animals. Camels are excellent pack animals for armies, because they can carry heavy loads across difficult terrain for many weeks at a time. They can go without water for a similar amount of time, and their sure-footedness means that they rarely fall and injure themselves, or their riders. So if you want to hear all about how camels have been used in warfare throughout history, check out the series, The Greatest Pack Animals in Warfare from Ancient Armies to Modern Conflicts. A link will be provided below. There are two main reasons that scorched earth tactics work so well. The first one is that your enemy needs to live to fight another day. Soldiers aren't much use if they die of starvation, and the inability to replace them quickly enough means that your army will slowly dwindle in size over time. This is why the North American colonies relied on the support of Britain so heavily during the Revolutionary War. They simply didn't have the resources to sustain two separate armies on the continent, so they shipped in supplies and soldiers from Britain until they won their independence. If the Continental Army had tried to blockade New York Harbor, for example, Washington would have had to surrender the city after a few months due to lack of supplies. This isn't just true for Revolutionary Wars either. It's one of the major reasons that the Confederate States of America lost the Civil War. They just didn't have the industrial capacity to keep up with the Union's ability to produce rifles, ammunition, ships, and food for the soldiers fighting in the field. The other reason scorched earth tactics work is that it denies your enemy the resources they need to sustain their war effort. If the local population has already reaped the benefits of the new taxes levied on them by the invading army, then there isn't much point in sacking the town. When the Romans sacked Gaul, for example, they knew that the Gauls had already paid their taxes for the year, and so they were free to pillage as much of the towns and cities as they could. They hadn't yet reaped the benefits of the taxes they had paid, so they weren't being denied anything. But when the Germanic tribes under Alaric sacked Rome in 410, the citizens had just enjoyed the fruits of their labor. There wasn't much left to pillage, so they moved on to sacking other Roman cities, and eventually North Africa. So scorched earth works when you deny your enemy the resources they need to sustain their war effort, and when you deny them the resources they need to survive. But scorched earth has its limits. It relies on the idea that you can control what your enemy consumes and where they go. But what if your enemy doesn't rely on the places you were able to capture? Napoleon's Grande was largely sustained by the commissariat system. That is, the French government set up supply depots filled with food and other necessities for the troops, and then soldiers would pick up their rations at designated spots along the route of the army's march. His army wasn't reliant on Russian farmers for food, so destroying their crops didn't really affect him, at least not at first. The problem was that the Russians chose to fight a war of attrition. They gave Napoleon no victories that would allow him to take credit back home in France for his successes. Instead, the Russians retreated deeper and deeper into their vast country, always staying just out of reach of Napoleon's grasp. He never got the big victory he needed to make his invasion worthwhile, and so his army slowly withered away, largely due to the harsh Russian winter. But the Russian winter wasn't the only factor in the destruction of Napoleon's army. The scorched earth tactics used by the Russians did play a role in Napoleon's eventual defeat. Let's take a look at the factors involved in the destruction of Napoleon's Grande. First, there was bad planning. The French emperor planned to march into Russia and force the Tsar to come to the defense of his nation. Napoleon thought that he could roll up the Russian army in northern Italy and march down through the Balkans to take Moscow. The trouble was that he grossly underestimated the size of Russia and the willingness of the Russian army to retreat instead of fighting. 2. There was disease. As the Grande marched across Europe, it picked up lice, fleas, and other diseases that killed thousands of soldiers. Even though the French army kept itself fairly clean, the armies of Europe were packed together tightly in close quarters. Soldiers slept next to each other, ate together, and drank together. So when disease struck, it struck fast and hard. 3. There was inexperience. Most of the officers in the Grande were inexperienced in waging war, especially against such a large and experienced foe. Napoleon put inexperienced relatives and friends in charge of armies, because he trusted them more than the experienced generals in the French military. This led to confusion and poor decisions in the field, especially during the Battle of Borodino. 4. There was bad weather. Napoleon's army struggled through snow, rain, and mud the entire way through Russia. Supplies froze, roads became impassable, and men's feet became infected with frostbite and other wounds. 5. And lastly, there were supply issues. The French army's supply wagons broke down in droves, making it difficult for the men to receive their daily rations. And the horses pulling the wagons suffered from the same problems as the men. Some horses died from exhaustion and others starved because their supply wagons couldn't keep up with the rest of the army. All of these factors combined to destroy Napoleon's army, but scorched earth wasn't one of them. While it may seem that the burning of the Russian countryside played a part in Napoleon's defeat, the truth is that it only contributed minimally to the destruction of his growth. The French emperor would have been wise to recognize the futility of trying to conquer Russia so early in the war. But that is not how history works. Napoleon made his mistakes and paid the price for them. Russia isn't the only place that scorched earth has been attempted. However, during the Vietnam War, U.S. and South Vietnamese forces practiced scorched earth tactics on the North Vietnamese, but it didn't stop the communist guerrilla fighters from winning the war. In fact, it arguably made the North Vietnamese people more willing to fight against the Americans. Since the Americans were burning their farms and villages, scorched earth has its limits. It cannot defeat an enemy that is willing to fight for their homeland. And it cannot defeat an enemy that does not depend on the land they are fighting on. China has developed a new strategy to trap all of Europe, but it's not one based on scorched earth. You see, China is building massive amounts of infrastructure projects across Europe. They are funding railways, roads, bridges, airports, and ports across the continent. Once completed, these projects will make it very difficult for Europe to sever ties with China. The Chinese government has already started construction on the most expensive infrastructure project ever, a $75 billion high-speed railway that will connect Beijing with the rest of China. Once complete, it will be impossible for China to cut Europe off from their markets. So if Europe wants to stop buying Chinese goods, they will have to tear up the roads and railways that the Chinese government built for them. This is essentially a form of economic colonization that the Chinese government is employing against Europe, and it will be very difficult to escape. Europe will have to completely reorient itself economically away from China and towards other partners, and there is no guarantee that they will be successful. Is China's strategy to trap Europe economically going to work? Will Europe find other suppliers for the goods it currently buys from China? Or will the Chinese economy become too important for Europe to ignore? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.